Hello my friends and welcome back to Nocturnity. Tonight we have a seriously bone-chilling story that is sure to have you thanking your lucky stars you're only a spectator to it, rather than a participant. I hope you're prepared for the terror. As always, this broadcast is brought to you by cardanapparel.com and the link is in the description, but before you go clicking it, first get yourself to a safe space, because the insanity is about to unfold as we slip together into the realm of eternal night. I was never a believer in ghosts, goblins, or anything that fits under the umbrella of the so-called paranormal. So when the dare was put forward to break onto Lake Ranch's property and steal 4 candy olive squashes in early November 28 years ago, I was all for it. Now, just to fill you in, believed to be sitting on top of an old Native American graveyard, and told to be the site of many Aboriginal wars, Lake Ranch is a farm on a massive tract of land, hundreds upon hundreds of acres, surrounded by deep forest outside of Marionville, PA. It's in an area that some locals call the Pennsylvania Triangle, on account of how many people have disappeared in those woods over the years, a fact that is only part of the horror-based lore attached to the place. It's accessible by only one long country road through the dense woodland, and basically only trucks transporting crops from the ranch ever make the journey. That being said, if you wanted to go there for some reason, the property is so large, when you reach it by road, you hit an unpassable gate about an hour's drive from anywhere near the actual ranch. So to get anywhere close to the crops, namely the squash patches that we were after, you'd have to make your way through the woods on foot, a journey that would take upwards of 12 hours at least, about 6 there and 6 back. But my name is Stanley by the way, me and my friends Ryan, James, and Mike, we were willing to give it a shot, because while out for drinks on Halloween night that year, campfire-style horror stories about Lake Ranch were being traded across our table at the Nilfum pub. All the classics were brought up: the monsters, demons, devils, witches' coven, and apparitions in the woods, the corn maze you couldn't escape, the whispering and moving trees, even alien abductions. I didn't buy a word of it, scoffing the whole time and admittedly ruining everyone's fun. Because of my skepticism, one of my friends, well, one of my acquaintances, I never much liked the guy, his name was Andrew, he put the dare out that if I really wasn't that scared, I'd have to prove it. And after a little bit of back and forth, terms were made. If me and my friends, the ones I just mentioned, if we snuck onto the ranch, Andrew would pay us each $500. A lot of money back then. Well, it still is. He was good for it too. His parents owned a paper company out here worth millions. He was a spoiled little prick, to be honest. It's one of the things I hated most about him. That being said, I was more than happy to take $500 from him for something so easy. But of course, in his words, he wouldn't have to pay a cent because we'd lose our nerve. Long story short, we took the bet, obviously. To experienced woodsmen like us, who grew up camping and exploring in the woods around there, it seemed like a piece of cake, just a long hike. It actually seemed like fun. The one catch was, like I alluded to before, we had to bring back 4 candy olive squashes from the patch on the ranch. These are rare squashes, high-priced delicacies that, at least back then, weren't grown anywhere else around here but on that farm, and would serve as proof and mementos of our endeavor. This, I'll remind you, is far before everyone walked around with a cell phone camera in their pocket. It all seemed easy enough to me. Moreover, just by chance, my sister's truck-driving boyfriend at the time used to do pickups from the ranch, so he was able to draw me up a crude map of the grounds, giving us even more of an upper hand. According to him, if we could travel northeasterly through the woods, when we hit their property, we could cut through the cornfields unseen. The cornfields would then empty out into the squash patches, and we'd be able to grab our targets and haul ass back to civilization. Be careful though, Stanley, I remember him warning me. The people who own the ranch are crazier than any of the stories of their land could ever be. They're real sullen and mean, and look like they crawled out of the 1800s, except for the rifles that they wear around their shoulders at all times of the day. They're not to be taken lightly by any means. I was never comfortable being there. If you're going to do this, get in and get the hell out. Okay, so that gave me a little trepidation about the scenario. But he also assured me the squash patches were miles from the house itself. And so long as we just grabbed a few under the cover of darkness and disappeared back into the corn, we'd probably be all right. So, a few mornings later, at around 10 a.m., me, Ryan, and James loaded into Mike's truck and headed to a parking lot off the highway we'd used before to go camping. Of course, we usually did that type of thing in the summer. This was a typical November day. Crummy, overcast, gray weather, and a temperature cold enough to see your breath. On the bright side, though, we were bundled up and carrying backpacks full of necessities. Food, water, matches, extra clothes, bear spray, flashlights, batteries, and first aid equipment, and so on. So the bitter cold would soon be welcomed as our body heat increased through the hike. For the most part, it was great. You get no better conversations with your boys than when you're on a hike. Your blood gets pumping, you're outside, and your spirits are up. The sun even began to shine around 1 o'clock, which is when we stopped by a stream for lunch. While we enjoyed soaking them up while we could, those golden rays didn't last long though. Unfortunately, neither did our good spirits. By 5:30, the sun was already going down. It was almost dark, and by our calculations, we should have been on our way back already. We must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. As our navigator, I took the heat for this when petty arguments began. Well, more like accusations from them and defenses from me. I just didn't get it. I'd looked at several maps before we'd left, and I had my compass in my hand most of the time. We should have seen the corn about an hour back from that point. With tempers flaring, we decided to take another rest and eat dinner while we got our bearings. To their credit, one thing they were right about was that you didn't want to get lost out there. Walking in the wrong direction for long enough could have you stuck out in those woods with no sign of civilized life for days. Like I said, many people had disappeared out there, never to be found again. And let's face it, we were lost. This was exactly what Mike was bitching about when he suddenly dropped his sandwich and went still, his eyes locked over my shoulder. I turned back behind myself to see what he was looking at. All I could see was thick woods. "What is it, Mike?" one of the others asked. "There's somebody over there," he replied in that soft tone that you use when you're talking about someone within earshot. Everyone stood up and took a good look. "I don't see anyone," Ryan reported, speaking for the rest of us. "She's gone now," Mike responded, not taking his eyes off the area he'd been observing. "She?" I asked. "Yeah," he confirmed. "It was a woman. I'd say an older woman in..." He then hesitated. "In?" James asked. "In what?" Mike took a deep breath, indicating slight embarrassment, before saying, "In a black cloak of some kind." I broke out in laughter. "Shut the hell up, Mike." "A witch? Did you see a witch? Was she carrying a broom and wearing a pointy hat too?" I was expecting him to laugh back with me like the others had. This was classic Mike, by the way. He had a real deadpan sense of humor that would suck you in every time, until he said something outrageous that would make everyone, including himself, laugh out loud. And he was prone to doing it in situations where everyone was arguing to break the tension with a shared chuckle. But he didn't laugh this time, not even the hint of a giggle. He didn't say a word, but instead just looked uncomfortable. "I'm just telling you what I saw," he finally said dismissively. Our laughing died down, and we all traded addled glances before staring back where Mike had seen whatever he'd said that he'd seen. I'll admit the hairs on my neck began to dance, even though there was nothing there to see. "Okay, fuck it, let's just go," Ryan put forward, clearly also feeling a little creeped out. Although we'd been arguing about turning back, myself heavily against the proposition, that eerie feeling helped sway the boys into continuing on, if for no other reason than to get away from where we'd just stopped. So, picking up our backpacks, we kept moving north. Not much was said for the next while as we trudged on through the trees. The mood that day had gone from good spirits to hostile to what we were now, cold and kind of on the edge of panic. The sun had officially gone down, and there still wasn't any sign of the ranch, or anything other than thick, dark forest for that matter. And keep in mind, we'd only packed for the day. We had no food for tomorrow, no tents for the night, and it was damn near freezing. Compound all this with the unyielding feeling that we were both being followed and watched, and you can begin to understand where our minds were at. All those stories of missing hikers were rifling through mine as we walked on. And so, by then, to me there was no question. They were right. We had to turn back. I felt like a failure putting the idea out there, because part of me felt like we were so close. I mean, we had to be. And worse, I was going to have to face that arrogant, condescending, spoiled jerk Andrew and tell him he was right when we got back. But the others were more than relieved to hear me finally come around. Getting back would be easy anyways. We'd walked in basically a straight line to where we ended up, so all we had to do was turn around. It would be hours in the cold before we got back to the woods we recognized by our car, but we'd get there eventually. I must say, the thought of a warm bowl of soup by the fire in my living room made the failure of not finding the ranch bearable, and it definitely gave me something to strive towards, because at that point, I was freezing. And so, I looked at my compass to verify that we were facing north, just before we turned around and headed in the opposite direction, south, back towards home. With our spirits elevated a little, we began to joke around somewhat, but that quickly died down as we reached the spot we'd eaten at before, where Mike had seen whatever it was that he'd thought he'd saw. Conversation naturally subsided to silence, and that eerie feeling crept back up my neck, amplified now by the fact that the only light available were the beams coming off our flashlights, which were tending to move in all directions at that point to gauge our surroundings. Around that time, maybe in a subconscious effort to enforce the thought that we were exiting danger in my own panicked mind, I took the compass out of my pocket to confirm we were heading home. But when I took a look, I stopped dead in my tracks. The others caught on right away and stopped as well. "What is it, Stan?" James questioned with concern. "The compass," I began, while I turned a 180 on the spot. This can't be right." "What?" Ryan demanded. I turned back to face the direction we were walking before, which we were all sure was south, and pointed my arm straight in front of myself. "The compass says this is north." "Impossible," Mike declared. "This is the complete opposite way we walked the whole way up here." Ryan shook his head in disappointment. "No wonder we never found the ranch. Our navigator's compass is a piece of shit." "No, it's not," James countered while he shone his flashlight on his own compass, which he'd just pulled out of his backpack side pocket. We all looked at it while I put mine right next to it. Both needles pointed in the same direction, indicating we had just been walking north, despite the fact that we were all sure we were going south. "So what, we should turn around and head back that way again?" asked Mike, pointing in the direction we'd just come from. "Hell no," Ryan contended. "We've walked that way all day. That's how we got lost." "Maybe we got turned around at some point," proposed Mike. "No chance," Ryan shot back. "We walked in a straight fucking line the whole time." He was right. It didn't take Magellan to know which way to walk to get home. We got here moving in one long straight line, as Ryan had just stated, and that line was facing north. This was like walking out your front door to the street and then turning around to walk back and seeing your house gone, and in its place, seeing the street you just turned your back on. Simply put, it made no sense. Our anxiety levels were now rising even higher. It was bitterly cold out there. We didn't know which way to turn. After some arguing, we all agreed that 2 compasses couldn't be wrong. So, against all our collective instincts, we turned around and started marching in the direction we'd just come from. And about half an hour later, we were back in the spot we'd eaten at again, and our flashlights were shining all around again to confirm we were alone. By now, our leg muscles were burning up, and it was becoming obvious we were going to have to stop, probably for the night. We discussed it as we were walking, but we didn't stop. We decided to go on for another 10 minutes, if for no other reason than to get past the spot of the witch, which is what we were calling it by then. A little while later, finding a small clearing, we dropped our bags and sat on some tree roots before pounding back water. Ryan and James, former scout extraordinaires, quickly got to work on a fire as I casually took my compass out of my pocket. I can't define the shock that hit me at that moment. All I could do was blurt out, "No way!" as I looked at the needle pointing up ahead. meaning we'd been moving north. A moment later, we were all freaking out as we compared both compasses again, each showing the same reading. It was completely unfeasible. No matter what way we walked, the needle pointed north. We went back and forth around the fire as we warmed our aching bones, trying to think up theories as to what could be happening. If we'd turned around again somehow, if the compasses were both broken. Then suddenly, James shot to his feet and began marching back in the direction we'd just come from. "Where the hell are you going?" I shouted after him. He turned back and said one word: "Magnets!" The three of us still around the fire looked at each other in confusion. Magnets? "Are you coming, Stan?" James then hollered in the distance. "Coming where?" I shouted back after him. "Pick up your compass and come on!" Shrugging my shoulders, I complied and rose to my sore feet to catch up with the man on a mission. In no time, we were walking at double speed with our compasses out in front of us, watching them as we bounded through the woods. "Magnets," James was explaining. "There must be some under the ground here changing the needle on the compass. Maybe some sort of metallic deposit under the ground or something. It would go to explain why people go missing up here so often." I couldn't help but to entertain the prospect, but the further we walked, the less faith I had in it, until suddenly my attention was diverted elsewhere. I recognized where we were. It was the witch spot. Oddly enough, my nerves began to tense up before my eyes recognized the place. Suddenly I found myself jumping in fear as James screamed, "Look!" Turning to him, I saw he was looking at his compass. I looked back at mine and my mind was jarred even further. The needle on my compass was spinning like a propeller. I began to say, "What the?" when a stick cracking behind us gave me a third jump. We whipped around and shone our light in the direction it came from to see a black figment disappear just out of view behind the trees in the near distance. Goosebumps took hold of me, and then grew in scope when all of a sudden a blood-curdling scream came from the direction where we'd left Ryan and Mike. Now topped with adrenaline, we wasted no seconds in booking it over roots and under branches, hightailing it back to our makeshift camp, internally preparing for the worst. The fire was visible through the trees in no time, but the closer we got to it, the more apparent it became that those friends of ours that we left sitting beside it were gone, though their backpacks still sat where they'd been dropped. "Where the hell are they?" we asked each other as we spun around the fire, shooting our lights in all possible directions, knowing full well the answer was unknown to us both. Inevitably, we both screamed their names at the top of our lungs, taking brief breaks to listen for a response. But nothing ever came. The panic had set in and made itself at home in our frazzled minds. Out of defensive instinct, we both reached for the bear mace cans in our bags. "They're just messing with us," James said as we continued to shine our lights in every which way. But his tone of wishful thinking betrayed his proposition. His intuition, like mine, had its siren blaring. Something was very, very wrong. There was no sign of a struggle, no footprints or broken branches anywhere to show for their escape, or their abduction. It was as if they'd just disappeared. After yelling their names for 10 or so minutes, we had a choice to make. Go off and search, or stay put until they hopefully returned. We opted to search, but made sure not to stray that far from the fire. Regardless, our efforts bared no fruits. We came back to the fire empty-handed, freezing cold, huffing and puffing, and scared shitless. The feeling of being watched only increased at that point. The vibration of imminent danger clung to the oxygen molecules in the air like epoxy, and every deep, labored breath soaked it into our central nervous systems that much more. We decided to spend the night back-to-back by the flames in order to have a 360-degree vantage point of this hellhole of trees we found ourselves sudden victims to. And out of all that had happened, through all that heart-pounding, fear-based adrenaline, what shocked me the most is that I was exhausted enough, sitting there and praying they'd return, and no one else would intrude, that I eventually passed out. It couldn't have been for long, but I slept for sure, because when I woke up it was morning. The clouds were blocking out the sun's rays, but not well enough to allow the darkness to survive, and I was alone. Freezing cold, sore and groggy, I scrambled to my knees and frantically looked around while I called James's name, but he wasn't answering my calls. Soon enough, I was not only standing, but marching through the leaves, twigs, and roots on the ground, aimlessly searching for any of my friends, desperately shrieking their names, but only the trees seemed to be listening. The feeling of hopelessness that overcame me then was like nothing I'd ever felt before. It tangled itself around the fear that had possessed me since the day prior and left me a walking shell of a man. I had no idea what direction was which. I didn't even have the mind to consider it. I spent most of the day just wandering indiscriminately with my arms crossed, shivering with each broken step, and every now and then calling out to James, Mike, or Ryan. I felt like I'd lost my mind, swearing the trees themselves were whispering to each other. What they were saying I couldn't tell, but I was sure it was at my expense. What's worse, I couldn't escape them. And in the midst of this madness, I'd wandered so far from where we'd made the fire I'd lost track, and so my backpack and any supplies we had left were now just as lost as my friends were, just as lost as I was. And then, around evening time, as I finally dropped to my knees by a stream to quench my thirst for the first time that day, I spotted movement. Not only spotted it, I heard it too. I froze on the spot, snapping somewhat back to reality as I peered about 50 yards to my left. Similar to the day before, the bushes and trees were swaying as if someone had just gone through them, and in my memory's recall, I swore I'd seen a human out of my peripheral seconds before. "Hello?" I called out, the water in my cupped hands below my chin draining through the cracks of my bitterly cold fingers. There was no response, at least not from that direction. My attention was instead lured to snap my head to the right as sounds of movement came from there. Again, I saw bushes moving as if they were just disturbed, but saw no sign of a person or animal. Another sound of snapping twigs then alerted me to pivot on my knees and face directly behind myself. There I saw a fright that I almost didn't believe I was truly seeing, but I swear to you now that what I say I saw. A woman, hideous to the sight, in a jet black cloak and pointed hat. A witch, if I've ever known of one, so close to how we depict them in lore, yet so real and so much more terrifying that we could ever delineate properly, came stepping slowly towards me from out of the fern. Her face, which could have believably been older than 100 years, wore a grimace so intimidating the fear it sent was physically sickening. Another noise to my immediate right forced my attention back in that direction, where another appeared from just behind the branches, just as ugly, and moving towards me with a scowl just as mean as her partner's. A crackle to my left revealed another. I was now surrounded, and left with no other choice than to back into the stream. It was so cold it was like the water was stabbing me, yet I just kept backing up into it until I was wading in a depth up to my waist. Behind me I heard more movement, and more to my sides. It soon came to be that I was truly encompassed by a herd of these demonic creatures, all of them in the same jet black hats and cloaks, none of them sending off a hint of anything but predatory death stares. They stopped on the shores and sized me up as I shivered in the water, turning every which way to face the overwhelming population of them glaring at me, one after the other. And then my nightmare only increased as they began to enter the stream. By the time they were within arm's reach, though I was weak, I balled a fist and swung as hard as I could. But the ones within striking distance bobbed their heads as if they'd been trained by Ali, and I came splashing down beneath the water, kicking my legs and thrusting my arms with the last strength I could marshal, trying my best to thwart the uncountable number of hands and arms submerging beneath the water with me. Soon I was being held down to the stream floor without a chance of moving an inch in any direction. They were drowning me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The panic in my brain reached a crescendo I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy before I succumbed to the inevitable, and everything faded to black. But of course, you and I both know I couldn't relate this tale from beyond the grave. Though it felt like I'd died a horrendous death there in that stream, I lived to wake up. How much later? I couldn't tell you, nor could I pinpoint where I was, other than to say it smelled horribly. I was soaking wet, cold, and laying in dirt, and through my blurred vision, I could see the walls around me in this space, no bigger than a typical tool shed, were made of wood, from which light from outside, sunlight or artificial, I don't know, was coming in through the cracks and some knotholes. Then, as my focus came back to me a little, I was terror-stricken to see 3 of the cloaked women from the stream staring from about 5 feet in front of me. Out of impulse, I shot to my feet and gave all the energy I could find to run, but within a couple steps I came to realize there was a metal collar attached to a chain locked around my neck, which strangled me in place while my legs shot out from under me. With that, I was back on the dirt ground, coughing and gasping, and thoroughly shocked that I hadn't broken my neck. I then heard the creaking of rusty door hinges as light flooded the dark room I was in. But by the time I'd turned to face it, it had disappeared. But there was a new face in the room. It was a man. He wore plain clothes. A dirty white button-up shirt under suspenders clung to black slacks. His face was bearded with no mustache, and his head wore a straw hat. The expression under its brim was one of frank humorlessness. Upon noticing him, I scurried on my ass backwards by pushing my heels into the ground until my back was flush with the wall behind me. He looked over at the three beside him, and then at me. "Welcome to Lake Ranch," he said in a European accent. I was too frightened to reply. "This is where you were looking for, no?" He held up a folded piece of paper and then flicked it across the room at me, jolting me in the process before it ricocheted off my head and onto the ground. I reached down and unfolded it. It was the map my sister's boyfriend had drawn up for me of the ranch's property, directing me on how to get to the squash patches. "You came to steal from us," he continued correctly. I remained speechless and routinely convulsing. "This was very stupid of you." Though the statement was more than obvious, it felt more like a threat than an assessment. "People who come into this part of the Allegheny woods rarely find their way out and die from their stupidity." He eyed me with malevolence. If he was waiting for a response, he'd be waiting for an eternity. I was too weak and panic-stricken to conduct any form of dialogue. That being said, my mind was racing a mile a minute, thinking that people who came into this part of the woods die because their compasses trapped them after falling victim to whatever witchcraft these devils were implementing. "What is your name?" the man then queried. He and the three witches beside him patiently anticipated my response, until eventually I found the will to speak. Stanley, I managed to croak out, then realizing how hoarse my throat was. "You may be a thief, but you're an honest thief," he returned, before tossing a card at me. I picked it up to see it was my ID. "Your compatriots were honest too," he then said with a maniacal smirk. Were? I thought to myself. What did he mean, were? "What the hell did you do to them?" I labored through my dry vocal cords. "They received exactly what they earned." The way he said it turned my terror to palpable, dismal hopelessness. This man, or his family, or whatever the hell these women were to him, had murdered my friends, and I was next. "Why toy with me?" I asked him. "Why not just do what you came to do?" He crooked his head to the side while he analyzed me, then glanced back at the witches in a manner where I could tell a signal was sent without having to say it. The beating of my own heart then overwhelmed all of my senses as he went for the rifle strap on his shoulder. I prayed the first bullet would kill me fast. However, then he put the rifle down and leaned it against the wall and stepped towards me. My impulse forced me to try to back away from him, but I was cornered, so, like the fawn being cornered by the wolf, I gave in to my fate and froze up as he pinned me to the ground. The witches then approached to join in on the massacre. One of them bent down, and I noticed an elixir bottle of some kind in her hand. She uncorked it and slowly brought it to my face. I jerked my head from side to side, but was prevented from continuing as another one of them reached down and gripped my chin. The putrid-tasting liquid was then poured into my mouth, and my nose and lips were sealed with the third woman's palm, forcing me to swallow all of the contents into my stomach. They then all let go and backed up as I thrashed around on the floor like a wild beast freshly yoked. But it didn't last long. Soon the potion took effect, and my vision went blurry before disappearing altogether. My eyelids parted much, much later. It could have been days for all I knew, but I was alive, as far as I could tell at least. There wasn't much light to be had around me, and I was far too groggy to figure out where I was at first. But when I did begin to regain my senses, I was surprised to feel cushion underneath me, rather than the dirt I'd last woken up on top of. Everything was sore, my ears were ringing, and my head was pounding. But that all took second rank to the shock I felt when I realized I was in the passenger seat of Mike's truck. I jolted up in my seat and looked beside myself to see Mike passed out and snoring in the driver's seat. Looking in the back, there was Ryan and James sprawled out across the seats back there. Apart from the ecstatic rush it gave me to see them all, it was also confusing me beyond comprehension. Was it all just a nightmare? My aches and pains told a different story. Most notably was the pain in my neck from where the metal collar prevented me from running. Moreover, I was filthy, and so were they. Before I began to shout their names, they began to awaken from their slumber, just as confused and sore as I was. But all that shock and confusion gave way to elation when we all realized we were all alive, sitting in the middle of the night exactly where we'd parked before our trek through the woods. We all had different stories to tell of how we'd been snatched by those women, which I'll now admit I believe was a bona fide witches' coven, and how we'd all met the same creepshow of a man while being held captive, before being drugged against our wills, convinced we were being poisoned to death. In the end, our tales were more similar than different from each other's, which is why each telling brought back the fear of our own experience so deeply. It was also terrifyingly traumatic, but boy were we grateful to be far away from that ranch. The further the better. It didn't take long for Mike to turn the key in the ignition and get the truck onto the road back home. We were due for a long time's worth of recovery. I was dropped off first, as my house was the closest, and as I began to hobble away from the truck towards my front door, I suddenly screamed for them to stop. The taillights lit up and the truck came to a screeching halt. I ran up to the flatbed of the pickup to get a closer look of what I thought I'd seen. Mike, Ryan, and James got out to see what I was looking at. There, before our eyes, were 4 candy olive squashes with the vines still attached. Pinned to one of them was a note that simply read, "Never return." A deal we planned on keeping. Well, my friends, we've survived to the end of another broadcast. I hope you've enjoyed the ride as much as I did driving you through it. If so, help out our young channel by giving this video a like, and if you'd be so kind, a share as well. To all those new to the channel, feel encouraged to join the fray by hitting that subscribe button. We'd love to have you aboard. As always, this episode was brought to you by CardanApparel.com, and the link is in the description for your convenience. The designer graphics on Cardan tees, crews, tanks, and hoodies will not only have you looking great, but you'll be supporting the continuation of this channel in the process. Our next broadcast is already in the works and will be coming to you in a matter of days. But of course, our channel is packed with stories for you to listen to now if you'd like to keep the vibe going. Until we meet again in the zone of Nocturnity, my friends, stay safe.